International news now.
Okay, in the news, we're going to talk about the recent violence surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so we're going to have a larger discussion about this conflict in U.S. foreign policy. And so last Friday, Hamas helped organize a mass protest in the Gaza Strip against the Israeli occupation and blockade of Gaza. Over 30,000 Gazans approached the physical barriers separating Israel from Gaza and built temporary encampments close to the no-go zone of land along the border that extends into Gaza about 100 meters from the fence. Some of the protesters included militants from Hamas. Some demonstrators burned tires, threw rocks, and Molotov cocktails. There were sporadic reports that a few Palestinians fired on Israeli military forces guarding the border. The Israeli army responded by firing on the protesters with live ammunition, but also used tear gas and rubber-coated steel pellets. At least 18 Palestinians were killed in this exchange, and there are conflicting reports of the number injured, but they range from 500 injured to 1,000 injured.
Can you pause for a second? So let's throw the next slide up that has a picture. And so this gives you some sense, right, of, you can see the fence there. There's Israeli soldiers on the bottom of the picture. They're launching tear gas. And then these are masses of protesters coming close to what's called the no-go zone. And the no-go zone it ranges anywhere from 100 meters beyond the fence into Gazan territory, are some places up to 200 or 300 meters. And basically what the Israeli army has said is they don't want people approaching this no-go zone, and if they rush the no-go zone, they will be fired on. And so you can see these dynamics in the picture here. And basically what happened is Hamas is organizing these protests, and many people are building temporary encampments or tents, and you can see some of those in the upper part of the picture that are very close to the no-go zone for a steady stream of protests that are going to occur.
Right. The no-go zone's a buffer zone to kind of increase the security along that border. So both sides have issued conflicting reports over whether the bulk of those injuries that we just stated stem from the live ammunition or tear gas and rubber pellets. And so there's some controversy over that. Now, this was the first of a series of public demonstrations that are likely to last until May 15th. And that date is significant. And it's significant because it marks the 70-year anniversary of Israeli independence and the subsequent Arab war against this new Israeli state. Israel declared its independence on May 14th, 1948. Its independence was immediately recognized by the United States and the Soviet Union. And then Israel was invaded the following day on May 15th, 1948 by a coalition of Arab states. Now, this May date is also significant because the United States and the Trump administration has promised to open its new embassy in Jerusalem by May 14th of this year. President Trump announced that the United States would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem in December of 2017. That's when he made the announcement. Now, this change is significant because the original United Nations compromise in 1947 that partitioned Israel and Palestine into two separate entities created a special international status for Jerusalem. Jerusalem was supposed to be administered by an international regime or agreement under the UN's authority. The UN and the EU, the European Union, continues to support this unique internationalized political status for Jerusalem. The United States effectively supported this status for Jerusalem as well until President Trump broke from prior presidents and recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel last year. And so that was a very contentious and controversial decision. And now that's what's building up to this May 14th
And that decision,
date.
and these protests are partly a response to
Right.
that decision as well.
Right.
Now, Gaza is a densely populated territory controlled by Hamas. It has nearly 1.9 million Palestinians living on a narrow strip of land totaling only 140 square miles that borders the Mediterranean Sea between Israel and Egypt. This political district has been under a blockade policed by Israel and Egypt since 2006. It's surrounded by a physical barrier. You saw pictures of that earlier. And Israel controls its airspace and also blockades maritime access into Gaza. Its population is effectively trapped there. With little international trade and limited access to resources, it suffers from significant unemployment of over 40%. Now, Hamas and Fatah are the primary ruling parties for the Palestinian people. While Hamas has traditionally been stronger politically in the Gaza Strip, Fatah rules the West Bank. Hamas has favored a more confrontational and militaristic approach with Israel, and it publicly supports the destruction of the Israeli state. Now, as part of the Oslo Accords in 1994, Israel recognized the Palestinian Authority as the government of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority was the successor organization to the Palestinian Organization, or I should say the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. Following Israeli disengagement from Gaza in 2005 and the Palestinian elections in 2006, which were won by Hamas, Hamas and Fatah fought a brief civil war over control of the Palestinian Authority and the territories it partially rules in Gaza and the West Bank. Now, this civil war effectively led to a division of political control between these two groups, with Hamas controlling Gaza and Fatah, let me get that right yet, controlling the West Bank. The countries that recognize Palestine as a state generally recognize Fatah as the head of the Palestinian Authority. Since this separation of Hamas from the Palestinian Authority, I'm struggling. I am having
that's
problems.
All right. No, that's all right.
There have been 3 wars fought between Gaza and Israel, one in 2008 and 2009, another in 2012, and a third in 2014. Now, the deaths in Friday's demonstrations were the most in this conflict since the 2014 war. Israel argues that these demonstrations are being used to prepare for a much larger attempt to breach the wall separating the two regions, which could then provoke another armed conflict. Now, before discussing more implications of these recent developments for U.S. foreign policy, we want to step back and provide you with a longer historical perspective on this extended conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people that dates back at least to the end of World War I. We're going to watch a video from Vox that does a great job of providing this historical overview. It packs a lot of information into the video, though, so we're going to pause repeatedly to reinforce important historical events and show you how they illustrate multiple concepts from our course. So let's go ahead and run the first clip of the video now.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about 2 groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in 2 important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first,
Okay, we're going to pause here and make a couple of points to reinforce some of the things that were raised in this video. Now, the first is that the video intentionally argues that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has not been going on for millennia, right? It's not this ancient hatreds kind of conflict. These groups lived together, Palestinians and Israelis, in relative peace in that region under Ottoman rule. See? Bad accent.
No.
The collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I created an opportunity for Great Britain and France to extend their imperial rule into the Middle East. Great Britain acquired political control over present-day Palestine as part of the mandate system under the League of Nations that sanctioned these imperial political systems, so this mandate system. More importantly, the video doesn't describe British diplomacy in World War I that helped to promote subsequent conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. The British government supported Zionists in Britain that sought a Jewish state in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. Now, why did Great Britain do this? Great Britain wanted to establish a territorial hold in Palestine to protect its access to the Suez Canal, which was, in turn, strategically important for its access to India. And support for Zionism was one way to facilitate this British influence in the region. However, at the same time, the British were extending promises of political independence and territory after the war to Arab groups as well that fought against the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Great Britain sought allies here that could facilitate the political collapse of the Ottomans and potentially help open a southern front against the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe. So the sum total of all this is the final years of World War I set the stage for the enduring conflict between Israel and Palestinians today. It incorporated a new British imperial system for Palestine that would ultimately provoke a political backlash from Arabs and Jews in Palestine. So that's an update here. So let's go to the next stage of this clip that brings us up to the creation of Israel in 1948.
the British allowed Jewish immigration. But as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel.
All right, so a few points here. First, after World War II, British imperial authority and influence is collapsing everywhere. We can think about this collapse in India, Greece, and Palestine as three prominent such examples. The United Kingdom can't afford to sustain its empire in the aftermath of World War II, and so as a consequence, it can't provide political order in these regions. So it's withdrawing from everywhere. In Palestine, the British imperial authorities can't prevent sectarian violence between Jews and Palestinians that are competing for influence there. Now, this sets up the need for a political transition, but it's unclear who will rule in this portion of the Middle East. Now, all of this illustrates the importance of great power war and political change that we discussed earlier. World War I influences the Middle East through the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. World War II resets the political order in the Middle East through the collapse of the British Empire. Now, second, the UN steps in and constructs a compromise designed to create separate Israeli and Palestinian states. Any conflict over control over Jerusalem was supposed to be alleviated by granting its special international status. Everyone would have access to the holy sites in Jerusalem, and the UN would administer Jerusalem to ensure that. Now, this compromise quickly breaks down. Third, Arab states resist the UN plan and fight a war against Israel. Israel wins the war and then seizes additional pieces of territory that had been assigned to the Palestinians under the UN plan. This creates the larger problem of Palestinian refugees who now flee and move outward from these original Palestinian territories and move into neighboring countries like Egypt and Jordan. And as a consequence, this movement of refugees creates an interest in these neighboring countries like Egypt and Jordan to fight wars against Israel to try and retake Palestinian territory from Israel so that these refugees can be resettled and can return to the Palestinian territories that were given to Palestine as part, or were allocated to Palestine as part of the UN compromise.
And it brought up this huge sort of moral and ethical issue about the right of return as well that complicates any future peace.
Now, fourth, the video doesn't spend much time on the Holocaust, but we have to emphasize its importance in the creation of the Israeli state and the identity of the Israeli people today. Hitler's genocidal campaign tried to destroy the Jewish people as a race. It's had a searing effect on Israeli politics. There's a clear hierarchy of interest in Israeli politics that's focused above all on national security and the preservation of the Israeli state and its citizens against all external threats. The conflicts in the Middle East with the Palestinians are viewed in Israel through this prism about the need to continue and maintain the Jewish race, or the Jewish as a people.
Right,
the Jews as a people.
And Israel as a state for Jews is very tied up in this idea that they face existential threats all around, and the only way to have that security is Israel, the state.
And part of this too, the Holocaust influences the domestic politics in the United States, in Great Britain, and in the West, and in Europe in 1946 and 1947, when these negotiations are occurring within the UN. Tremendous domestic pressure on Western states to support the creation of an Israeli state.
Right.
All right, so now we're going to watch another 30 seconds of video, and what's important here is thinking about the legacy of the 1967 war. Let's roll that clip.
Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades.
Okay, so briefly we want to emphasize here the political and territorial significance of this 1967 war. So Israel defeats a coalition of Arab states that includes Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Israel then takes new territory from Syria that it continues to hold today. And it secures a buffer zone with Egypt by seizing the Sinai Peninsula and then consolidates its hold over the remaining Palestinian territories in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So this war sets up the government of Israel as an occupying or imperial power responsible for Palestinians in the territory that Israel controlled. Now recall as well the significance of the Golan Heights in the current Syrian war. The Israeli government worries now that Iran is establishing a territorial hold just to the east of the Golan Heights by supporting Assad's regime in Syria that could be used to launch an invasion against Israel in the future. Okay, so let's go back to the video, and this next segment will get us from 1967 to the 1980s.
In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the U.S.-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
The settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short-term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long-term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal.
All right, so this period shifts the conflict from one among Israel and a coalition of Arab states in the region to a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, because Israel constructs a series of peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan in particular. Now, the most important development that we want to focus on during this time is the movement of people within Israel and the establishment of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. It is changing the political reality on the ground in these territories that were originally assigned to the Palestinians as part of the UN deal. What happens as a result? You have Israelis, citizens moving into the occupied West Bank, and so the Israeli government needs to send security forces in the region to protect them on the ground. Effectively, what this is doing is strengthening Israeli control of the West Bank on the ground. It's creating a new political reality on the ground. Now think about this in terms of the long run and what a potential deal might look like if there is a two-state solution where the Palestinians are given new territory, or giving territory that was part of the original 1947 settlement, and they then get to administer this on their own. How can the Israeli government effectively abide by the terms of that new treaty or two-state solution, because it's going to require what? They're going to have to move their people out of these regions. Effectively, what that means is the government will have to nationalize these new residents that has been created and then force its own people off that land to give it back to the Palestinian state. And then the question becomes, can any Israeli government in the future make such pledge? And think about the domestic costs associated with nationalizing homes of Israeli citizens to give it back to the Palestinians. What would be the political cost for an Israeli government in this sense? Now, the important thing to realize too is that the political status of these settlers and the settlement regions has been an important source of conflict between, not only between Israel and Palestine, but between Israel and the United States. President Obama in particular was in the process of trying to get tougher with Israel for not halting the growth of settlements in the West Bank. And this was the source of significant tensions between the two. Also, the Iran nuclear accord was important to this, but the settlements were a key source of tension between the United States and Israel under Obama, and Trump has moved away from this. There's been some public criticism of the settlements, but this is one of the reasons why the Israeli government was happy to see Republicans in the White House and to see Trump win, because it has helped to alleviate this pressure within the alliance on them for their settlement policy.
I mean, Trump has been kind of inconsistent on settlers, but that inconsistency is good for an Israeli government that doesn't want to get real tough with settlers. I mean, they need, if there's going to be a halt to this, there would have to be a very consistent U.S. pressure to stop it, and that you're not going to get that from this Trump administration. So
let's go to the next clip that talks about the political and military rise of Hamas.
By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, who considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks, with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since.
Okay, so two important points here that tie into some of the material that we covered from the terrorism chapter here. First, we see the political emergence of Hamas out of the first Intifada. They continue to rule Gaza and helped organize the current round of demonstrations that was our focus for the news for today. Now, the second is we see an important political role for terrorism in this dispute. Remember the strategic role that terrorist organizations can use political violence as a spoil negotiations for peace. The role of spoilers is important here. So Hamas launches terrorist strikes against Israel to create doubt about the ability of the Palestinian Authority to abide by the terms of any peace settlement with Israel. That doubt that is created by a more radical element within this authority helps to sabotage this peace. And Israel then withdraws from the peace process after 2000 because the Palestinian Authority cannot force Hamas to halt terrorist attacks and abide by the political terms of any peace. Now, why would Hamas want to do that? It's because it doesn't want an end to this conflict that could very well mean the loss of its status and its role in Palestinian politics. And so instead of allowing a peace that might undermine its own authority, it tries to continue the conflict by spoiling the peace negotiations through terrorist attacks. And so we're going to run a clip now that ends the thing, right?
No, there's 2 more clips. So let's just run to the next clip, and then we'll go from there.
Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. But the second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just to manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, and that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know.
All right, so 2 important points here. Following the second intifada, Israel shifts its strategy. It withdraws from Gaza and imposes barrier walls to prevent terrorist strikes into Israel. It imposes a blockade to prevent the movement of trade, militants, and weapons in and out of Gaza. But the net effect of this blockade is to create horribly harsh living conditions in Gaza. Second, Hamas and Fatah then fight a civil war. Fatah, I did it again. It's like, it's my MSB. Fatah assumes control of the Palestinian Authority and presides over the West Bank. So they fight this civil war and they basically separate. And Hamas holds Gaza. So you have this division of authority among the Palestinians with one group in control of Gaza and one group with political, I hesitate to say political control because Israel still occupies the West Bank. But the Palestinian Authority has some political authority that's still always superseded by the Israelis in the West Bank.
But
anyway,
this split also helps to undermine any peace negotiations as well, because what Israel always argues is there's not one partner to negotiate peace with. And then, so who are we supposed to talk to? Because there's a split there.
So let's run the last clip here.
Know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence, though most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
So that provides the background on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that brings us up to today. Now, last Friday's demonstrations could represent potentially a new phase in the conflict between Israel and Hamas over the Gaza Strip. Hamas has said that this is only the first phase of a wave of protests that will continue up until May 15th of this year at least. Now, Israel is worried that these public demonstrations could be cover for a broader military campaign that tries to break through the barriers that Israel has erected around the Gaza Strip that control the flow of weapons and militants in and out of Gaza. So we're going to run a clip now from PBS that provides a summary of these events from Friday and Saturday, and then we're going to come back and talk about this a little bit more. Let's run the clip.
In the area near the Israel-Gaza border, large crowds attended funerals today for the 16 Palestinians killed yesterday by Israeli soldiers. Thousands of Palestinians had marched to the border at the start of a demonstration that's expected to last for the next 6 weeks. Israel is blaming the bloodshed on Hamas and is warning of possible action inside Gaza. Joining me now via Skype from Jerusalem is Joseph Fetterman of the Associated Press. Joseph, besides the funerals, what's happening today?
Yeah, it looks like today they're taking a bit of a breather. The size of the crowds is down significantly. There have been clashes, but they're very sporadic today. But like I say, it's more of a breather than an end to this, and we're expecting things to pick up in the coming weeks. Most of the time on Fridays, which is the Muslim holy day, that's when the biggest events are planned.
Who's organizing the protests and what's the goal?
Yeah, it's the Hamas militant group, which controls Gaza. They're the force behind this. And they're doing this for a bunch of reasons. Basically, Hamas has controlled Gaza for over a decade. They seized control of Gaza in 2007 from the Palestinian government that rules in the West Bank. And since that time, the territory has been under a blockade by Israel and by Egypt. And now the Palestinian government in the West Bank also is putting some pressure on Hamas. So they're feeling it from all directions. The result is that conditions are very bad right now in Gaza. Unemployment is over 40%. There's only a couple electricity for a few hours a day. Conditions are very difficult, and Hamas is running out of options. So now they're doing this. And the idea is, I think, to kind of stir things up, to press Israel, to draw attention to the conditions in Gaza without falling and plunging into another war.
What are actions that the Israeli government can take inside Gaza?
Well, what they've done so far is they've basically turned the border area into a no-go zone. And what you saw yesterday, we had over 700 people were shot on the Gaza side with live fire by Israel. They are not allowing people to get anywhere near the border fence, probably about 200 to 300 yards. Anybody who comes closer risks being shot. In addition, the Army today issued a new threat. They said, we're not just going to act along the border area. We know who's behind this. Hamas is behind this, and we reserve the right to act against Hamas and any other militant groups in Gaza in other areas. So that's the type of escalation we could be seeing down the road.
And what about the international community weighing in on what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, there's a lot of concern. Yesterday, the Security Council had an emergency meeting. There was a call by the UN Secretary General for an investigation. There are concerns that Israel may be using excessive force. The European Union put out a statement today saying any violence, any shooting should be properly investigated. So I think the main concern, people want to see restraint. They don't want to see this spin out of control. We've had 3 wars in Gaza between Israel and Hamas over the past decade, and I don't think anybody wants that to happen again. So they're really playing with fire with this one.
All right, Joseph Fetterman of the Associated Press joining us via Skype from Jerusalem. Thanks so much.
All right, a couple things to emphasize here. First is that this is the first of what's going to be a wave of protests, probably centered on Fridays until the middle of May. Right? So what's driving these protests? Why? What's Hamas doing? They're trying to weaken support for the blockade. They're trying to create political pressure on Israel to change its policy relative to the Gaza Strip. But the journalist also talks about this, in a sense, they're acting strategically because they don't want to fight another war.
No.
And so they're trying to press it as far as they can without creating another war. Now, Israel is blaming Hamas. They're worried about the security of its border and its breakdown. And the larger question here that's significant for American foreign policy and the region is, can these protests and the violence that stems from them be controlled? And it's a little bit unclear. And in terms of the larger conversation that we've been having about terrorism today, we just called up something. So there's now a new war of words that's going on between Turkey. Erdogan has called Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, a terrorist, and he has said that Israel is a terrorist state. Israel is saying, and the military officials that spoke publicly about the protests and the Israeli army's response said that we were targeting terrorists. It was the militants within Hamas that were cultivating terror terror and terrorism, and that's why we struck back. So this was national defense.
Right.
And so we see the challenges of the, of defining terrorism here, because it is a politically powerful rhetorical device to label someone a terrorist, because then you can justify pretty harsh measures against that. And the point here is both sides are doing this.
They're not analyzing terrorism here.
No.
They are trying to make a political statement. When you call someone a terrorist like the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, did, he's trying to make a political statement. He's not doing, analysis. So that's a very big part of the whole politics surrounding terrorism. Is just the political significance of the term itself.
And the final thing we just want to mention here is the U.S. role in all of this. The U.S. is a target of these protests as well, because of the shift of the embassy, moving it to Jerusalem. Right, this is a change in American policy, and it's a deviation from a longstanding American policy to, in a sense, give Jerusalem special status as an international city of the holy sites that should be open to all states. And so what this is effectively doing is saying, well, Jerusalem is the Israeli capital, which implies then that Jerusalem is part of Israel.
And under the control of Israeli authorities.
Yeah.
And that's going to cause some conflict.